Again, protists are a very diverse group of organisms. There are some protists that have a parasitic lifestyle, and some of these can infect and cause disease in humans. Here are just some examples of human diseases caused by protist parasites. African sleeping sickness is, as the name suggests, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, and is spread by a fly known as the tsetse fly. Infection with this parasite causes high fever, headache, and muscle ache. Giardia is one that you could catch here in the US. In fact, it's fairly common for dogs to get this infection because it's usually spread through food or surfaces contaminated by feces. It causes severe diarrhea. Cryptosporidium is another diarrhea-causing protist parasite that you might encounter here in the US. It's spread through contaminated water. This parasite is the main reason that public pools usually have signs asking you not to swim if you've had diarrhea recently, because it could potentially be spread in swimming pools. And the last one on this list is really freaky. Primary amoebic meningoencephalitis infections occur when the amoeba gets into the sinuses, usually when swimming. Fortunately, it's very rare. But once the parasite gets into the sinuses, it starts to eat away at tissue, eventually reaching the brain, at which point it can cause very severe symptoms or even coma or death. So this parasite is why if you use a neti pot, you should always sterilize the water before pouring it through your sinuses. But probably the most well-known disease caused by a protist parasite is malaria. Because it has such a devastating impact around the world, we're going to focus on this one particular disease and talk about it in much more detail. Malaria is mostly a problem in warm climates. However, as the climate changes and the mosquito that spreads the parasite expands its range, malaria is starting to occur in the southern US. In 2023, a few local cases were reported in Texas and Florida. But again, that range will probably continue to expand as temperatures rise and the mosquito species that vectors malaria move further north in the US. But as of right now, malaria is of biggest concern in Africa, where it is a major cause of death. This graph here shows malaria deaths by year in different regions around the world. You can see that the vast majority of those deaths are in the African region in purple. Around the world, 600 to 800,000 people die every year from malaria. So we mentioned that the range of malaria is likely to expand with climate change, as mosquito ranges change in response to warmer temperatures. This is because malaria is a vector-borne disease. This means it's caused by a pathogen that is transmitted by a biting arthropod. Usually those arthropods are either insects or arachnids. In the case of malaria, several species of mosquitoes can vector the parasite. It's important to make sure you use the terminology of vector-borne disease correctly. The organism, or other agent such as a virus, that causes a disease is known as a pathogen. In malaria, the pathogen is a protist known as Plasmodium. The organism that transmits the pathogen is known as the vector. In malaria, the vector is a mosquito that carries the protist parasite from an infected individual to an uninfected individual. The host is the organism that becomes infected with the pathogen and develops the disease. Humans are a host for the Plasmodium parasite that causes malaria, but many other animals can also become infected. The disease is the set of symptoms that result from infection with the pathogen. It's important to note that the pathogen itself is not a disease. Again, the disease is the symptoms that result from an infection. Okay, so now that we have that terminology, let's look at how to correctly use it. So again, malaria is not a pathogen. It's just a set of symptoms that result from infection. Likewise, Plasmodium, or the protist parasite, causes malaria, but it is not a disease. It's a pathogen that causes disease. So you cannot be infected with malaria. Remember, malaria is not the pathogen. You are infected with the pathogen, and the pathogen causes disease, which is a set of symptoms. Likewise, the vector does not cause the disease. It only spreads the pathogen. So malaria is not caused by mosquitoes. Mosquitoes transmit the pathogen that causes malaria. Now let's look at how the parasite that causes malaria is transmitted. First, an uninfected person is bitten by a mosquito that is carrying the protist parasite. The parasite gets into the bloodstream, where it starts to infect red blood cells. Then the parasite does something interesting. It actually modifies proteins on the surface of the blood cells. Remember how surface proteins were important for viruses to recognize host cells? The immune system recognizes infected cells in a similar way. So once the parasite has modified these surface proteins, it's difficult for the immune system of the host to recognize and destroy infected cells. Now the parasite is circulating in the infected person's blood. When a new mosquito bites that person, it can take up the parasite. Now, if that mosquito bites an uninfected person, they may become infected with Plasmodium. So why is malaria so hard to treat and prevent? Well, there's several different reasons. One is that Plasmodium has a complex life cycle in the human body. There are many different life stages that the parasite goes through in different organs and parts of the body. This makes it difficult to develop treatments because each of these life stages may respond differently to different treatments. Malaria is also difficult to treat because Plasmodium is great at getting around the immune system. Again, because it modifies the proteins on the surface of infected cells, it's able to hide those cells from the immune system. This also makes it very difficult to develop vaccines to prevent malaria. Malaria is also hard to treat because the parasite Plasmodium develops resistance to treatments very quickly. A new drug is introduced, and Plasmodium adapts to become resistant to that drug, making the drug ineffective. If you take a look at this graph, you can see several different types of treatments for malaria on the y-axis. On the x-axis, we have number of years that the treatment was effective in blue. Once the bar turns red, it means that Plasmodium has developed resistance to the drug and is no longer effective. Spend a minute or two looking at this graph. Notice how quickly some of these drugs became ineffective. The antifolates, the third bar down on this graph, were only effective for a few years before Plasmodium developed resistance. So again, we are constantly having to develop new drugs to try to kill this parasite. Anytime you see a graph in this class, it's important to make sure you can read and interpret it. Pause the video and spend a minute looking at this graph and see if you can figure out which drug class had the longest efficacy. Notice that the period of time the drug was clinically effective is in blue. Another way to prevent malaria is to reduce the risk of being bitten by a mosquito carrying the parasite that causes it. However, this is difficult. Mosquitoes have a complex life cycle and are very abundant. The larvae that you can see here in this picture live in water, but the adults are terrestrial. There are also several different species of mosquitoes that can vector Plasmodium. So reducing their populations without causing other negative effects is very difficult.